Hello everyone! So I have another question that I'm answering today that is by WSP912, and it's a quite interesting question. Thank you so much by the way. And this is related to composers and interpretation of classical music. And then this is why I'm so happy to answer, because the question is, what are my thoughts on pianists that learn from composers themselves and they have a different interpretation that they even teach sometimes that differs from the musical score. And this happens a lot. This is quite interesting, but we have to start saying that there is a good side and a bad side. And also we need to keep in mind that these interpretations as it was teach in the past taught but it was taught by these pianists in the past, these are not anymore in use in the sense of that the market itself are not caring for that. Doesn't mean it's not interesting, doesn't mean that you cannot even use this now. Must use actually, because the market is too boring, right? But the point is, I say we have a good and bad example. Why? Let's keep in mind the history of Anton Schindler, for example. He was too much connected to Beethoven, and after Beethoven passed away, he was trying to teach young students and even some young professionals about how to interpret Beethoven. And the ones that didn't accept his teaching were objects of his criticism, hard criticism, saying that they were not even good musicians at all. And this makes many people angry, and this is not good for his own image, not good for the history of Beethoven, not good in any sense. But we don't know exactly what was in their mind, how this really happened, because we have sometimes just one side of the story. So, but it's interesting to read about and think the effects that this have. Another not so good example, we have Anton Streletsky, that he writes a lot of histories about he and Liszt, and we know that most part of that is not more than jokes. But going ahead, well, we have many interesting examples, like for example, the Franz Liszt, when he was teaching, one of his students was playing one of his Schubert arrangements, and at some point, Liszt say that it was wrong, that must be played different. Then he went to the piano and played completely different from what he was writing, and then he noted that he was playing not what is in the score, and then he say, "Oh, I need to rearrange this because it must be this way that I'm playing now." So his concept changed, and then he make a second version, and he wrote and published that. So we can compare two versions of his own interpretation, and this is fantastic. It's a great thing. But we don't have the same luck sometimes with many other composers. We have examples like, for example, with Rosenthal, Maurice Rosenthal. He was a composer too, but he played for Brahms, the Brahms variations on Handel 10. And at some point, a long time after, he was teaching, I think, Charles Rosen, and Charles Rosen was playing that same variations. And then at some point, Rosenthal said, "No, you are playing wrong. It's different." Then he went to the piano and played. And then Charles Rosen said, "But it's writing here differently from what you are playing." And then Rosenthal said, "Oh, so I played wrong all my life." And Brahms never corrected me, and he even praised my playing. So the fact is that makes we think that Brahms accepted a different version from what he wrote. And then the student, I think Charles Rosen, said, "So I follow you." And he said, "No, you follow Brahms' score, because you never played for Brahms. I played from Brahms. He accepted me to do this. Doesn't mean he's going to accept everyone to do this. So you do what's in the score." And I think it's quite interesting approach, quite a smart way of think about music. And in this way, you're not going wrong in any way. But sometimes, of course, I'm not conservative, so I understand and accept the changing. And I just think that if you start changing too much, at least write your name and say, "I am arranging this again." This is, I think, is much more interesting than just changing things. So if you sign this as arranger, I think it's quite interesting. If you really change too much. But not this only. We also can keep in mind that another examples, like for example the Rachmaninoff Sonata Number 2. Rachmaninoff Sonata Number 2. Rachmaninoff made the first version, the second version, and he was not happy with both versions. And then Horowitz said, "Make a third version, selecting what you think is the best from both." And apparently Rachmaninoff has said to Horowitz, "No, you do it, not me. You do this for me." And Horowitz apparently never did, I think, because I never found the musical score writing by Horowitz himself. But he played in ways that is not exactly first version, is not exactly second version. So that is supposed to be a third version. And one of the recordings that he left, even some of them having differences, one of these recordings was, let's say, my favorite. And I like the structure, the way he makes simple. And I think it was more interesting than the first version and then the second version. So I prefer that version. And when I make my own arrangement for left hand of the sonata, I decided to add that structure from that Horowitz recording. And then I put Rachmaninoff, Horowitz, Semihu. So because I need to mention that this is coming from that reference. And this is a case where I'm following the recording, right? So you see, I'm open to. I just cannot think that because there is a recording, the recording is more important than the score. But in this case, I know a story that apparently have the permission of Rachmaninoff himself. And I know that because I have heard many recordings of Rachmaninoff himself playing his own music. And when he's playing, sometimes he's completely different from what he wrote. And this is quite interesting. Doesn't mean that he want me to or want us to follow his recording, but doesn't mean that he don't want to. So it's open to discussion, open to decision, as long as you are not just copying his interpretation. His changes sometimes are quite interesting, and why not? So it's something quite interesting to select between this and that. Another very interesting thing that we need to consider is when we think about, I said Brahms, for example, and there's another interesting thing related to interpretation that is, I think one of students of Clara Schumann mentioned that he was reading the score of Brahms while Brahms was playing, and he noticed that every time there was a crescendo and a diminuendo, there was a rubato. I don't remember if he used the word rubato itself, but he mentioned that together with crescendo was like accelerando, and together with the crescendo was retardando. So in some way, if you start to approach the music keeping this in mind, the way the music is going to sound is quite different from normal interpretations nowadays, or the standard interpretation nowadays. And by the discussions that I read about this, apparently this is something that would apply in Schumann music, it will apply in Mendelssohn music and all the conservative composers of those times. So it's interesting to think about. Doesn't mean that Brahms never wrote that, oh, this is the rule, this is the way for playing my music, but doesn't mean that maybe can be one of these ways that can have a very good result. You can use part of it, or you can use this concept in one piece of music that you think that is reasonable. But it's very important to keep in mind that interpretation is not just about how you deal with the expression of the music and the notes. It's also about what is related to extra musical elements, which extra musical elements are related to that. If you think about Franz Liszt, we have plenty of them. You cannot think about Vale d'Obermann without Senancourt book, or even Byron. We cannot think about you cannot think about the Mephisto Waltz without Leno version of Faust. You cannot think about Faust Symphony without thinking about Goethe. You cannot consider, Après une lecture de Dante without Dante Alighieri. So all these things affect directly the way you are going to understand the atmosphere of the music. So we can go, for examples like Friedheim, Arthur Friedheim, when he was studying the Transcendental Etude number 11, and Liszt said to him to come to the window and see the sun going down and say, that is Harmonie du Soir. So this is a completely extra musical thing. And yet, this was the main reference that Liszt gave to Friedheim to interpret the piece of music. So it's interesting when we think about this and we try to create from that a kind of atmosphere of sound. And especially if you have the opportunity to visit the place, if you go to Tivoli, for example, where he was teaching, and then if you can see the sunset in that place and try to connect yourself to that, Of course, this is going to be a little bit more nostalgic, but I don't think that listing that moment was less nostalgic than we are going to be if we do this. Um, but also, we can also discuss what happens with, for example, Chopin. Chopin nowadays, if you think about how his etudes are played, they are played like a race, like competition. So Opus 10 number 5, everyone wants to play the Black Keys very fast. Everyone wants to play Opus 10 number 4 very fast. Everyone wants to play Opus 10 number 1 very fast. And even polonaises and things trying to play fast. I also sometimes feel too much attracted by this. But the point is, we know that by some related letters saying that I don't remember who played for Chopin, but someone played for Chopin and he was almost crying because the person played too fast, something that was not supposed to be so fast, and that hurt him in some way. So if you think about how this emotion of playing fast something that is difficult sometimes can go completely the opposite of the intention of the composer, we are going to see that most of what is done in a market sense is quite aggressive to the concept of the artist. And so Chopin is one of these cases where you have no real tradition. The people nowadays speak too much about the legato, and when it comes to the real result, you listen to them using the pedal, you don't feel that real legato that is so much discussed. Sometimes you have so much, nowadays you have so much standardization that I think this is too much affected now. But getting back to the concept of what the composer or arranger make and what is the recording or what is passed away, we have Zifra. Zifra make that arrangement from the Bumblebee. Fantastic arrangement in interlocking octaves. But we have his writing that I think Editio Musica Budapest published, and we have the writing of what's the name? Istvan Toma, maybe, I don't remember, that wrote from the recording, take by ear, writing from the recording. He make a version of some of the main arrangements of Zifra, and his version writing by published on Peters, I think. This arrangement is much more related to the way that Zifra really played than the version that Zifra wrote. Zifra wrote a completely different version. I think the only moment that I see Zifra together with this musical score that, or with the playing of this musical score that he wrote, is when Katsaris played for him. There is a video of this even, very interesting. And Katsaris played this version that was writing and published by Editio Musica Budapest. But Zifra, all the records that I heard, is always different from that writing version. And basically nowadays, maybe 90% of the pianists that played the Bumblebee in Zifra version played the version from Peters' edition. And so what I would say about my concept on how to approach this kind of histories is you see case by case, or you see what happens in each case, what's the effect of that. My beginning is always the musical score. The musical score is my first connection with the composer. If he make a mistake, and the mistake, he never try to make a change on that mistake, if there's nothing that proves that he wants to make that change, then I will consider that mistake is intentional. Because mistake everyone can do. Sometimes the mistake is obvious. Sometimes you can see that is a mistake on the publishing house that you can correct. Sometimes the mistake is compositional. You can see that there is something that the composer wrote that makes no sense and no one corrected in time. The composer didn't correct. The revisors, sometimes even the revision of the composer or others never correct. Sometimes happens too. And then sometimes you have the recording. When you have the recording of the composer, I always like to listen, but normally it's not in my first stage anyway. So the first stage is musical score. If I have after this, if I'm going to listen to something, first thing I will try to listen to the composer, and then I can consider listening, for example, if the composer even mention or teach someone, this person I would listen to first and see what is connected or disconnected to that main idea, and then all the other interpretations that might have some interest at all. So I am quite open to consider these things, but each case is completely different from the other, because as I said, sometimes some people were connected to 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 the to the composers, and by some reason, and they, when they have the chance to write something and even to remain the history, sometimes they lie, like Anton Streletsky and others, like that what's the name of that guy, Gottschalk, not Gottschalk the composer, but Gottschalk the organist that also studied with Liszt. He said some crazy stories about Karl Tolzig that makes no sense, and just because he didn't like Tolzig. And so there are plenty of things that we need keep in mind. I will never say that one of these things are a rule in the sense of need find this follow this strictly or not. When I record the Liszt sonata, I use the score as a reference. I didn't use recordings because the most I listened to recordings, the most sure I was that I must not follow them. And I think I heard more than 100. Don't remember how many now, but it was too much records that I catched and heard, including Friedheim. But at some point I could not agree with them. And one important thing that we need to keep in mind is that sometimes the teaching that the composer is giving for a performer is not necessarily something that must be passed away in that way for other students. Because if the pianist, the student, is playing and he is struggling to make any difference or nuance, as a teacher, the composer must say, you need to make a much more vibrant crescendo, a much more exaggerated crescendo. And then maybe this pianist will do the right crescendo that's not so exaggerated at all, but for his understanding need to be exaggerated, otherwise he, by his playing, will never reach the standard sound that the composer is expecting. And then when he teach, he's going to say to another student, oh, you need to make a crescendo, exaggerated crescendo in this point. But the problem is that maybe this student is too strong in the playing, so this exaggeration will be much more than what was expected by the composer. So sometimes teaching exactly the same words will have different effects. So we need to keep this in mind. What the composer say for his student is because he say that for that student, because that student was playing in a wrong way before. So if we keep this in mind, then I think the mystery will be a little bit more easy to solve. We are going to have some more interesting options to make, and we can consider after we listen, for example, for some recordings. If you have a recording of that person, you can try to think, oh, here must be a exaggerated crescendo. Then you listen, but he's doing so exaggerated as I can do, or can I expect to do in this? I need to think about these words when I'm playing to make the same effect. So when you teach someone, we need to think about an individualistic process of the teaching, the teacher for the student, for the learner, and this is going to affect a lot the final result if you just transfer the words to another person. Yeah. Well, enough. I think that this hopefully answer your question. And thank you again. And if anyone that have any kind of question related to the subjects that I'm pointing out here are very welcome, and always a pleasure. So see you.